Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming out on what I think we might all agree is a slightly unseasonably cold night. So even if you just came in to get warm, we'll forgive you tonight. I'm Bill Brown with Brookings Mountain West. Welcome on behalf of my colleagues, including Rob Lang and Caitlin Saladino, to Greenspun Hall and to the auditorium here. You can see our colleagues are helping us record this event. It'll be up on YouTube in a few days. You'll be able to see it on public television. We're grateful for that opportunity. Our colleague tonight, Dany Bahar, will speak on the topic you all see, something quite relevant and important to us here in Las Vegas, as well as the nation, as well as the globe, for that matter. And we will truly get a global perspective tonight. We are thrilled to have Dany back with us. Like our visiting scholars from Brookings, he's midweek, but he has and will be speaking to UNLV classes in political science, economics, public policy, a few others I'm probably forgetting. He's meeting with students and faculty to discuss their research and his. And of course, he's here with us tonight. Let me tell you a little bit about Dany. Right now, he's a David Rubenstein Fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program at Brookings, but that's soon to change. We were thrilled to hear he'll, in the near future, become a Senior Fellow at Brookings. Dany, his research focuses on migrants and refugees as economic drivers, alongside trade and capital flows. His expertise on policy issues includes international migration, trade, and globalization, and understanding economic trends in the global economy. He is more than just a Brookings scholar or pure academic. He's worked and consulted for multilateral development corporations such as the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. Dany holds a BA in Systems Engineering from the Universidad Metropolitana in Caracas, Venezuela. He also has an MA in Economics from Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He also has a Master's in Public Information from the International Development from the Harvard Kennedy School. And that wasn't enough. He needed a PhD in Public Policy from Harvard. So we're going to get an interdisciplinary and international perspective on an important topic tonight. Dany, of course, looks forward to taking your questions as well. So let me get out of the way and invite Dany to come up.
Thank you so much for coming. I'm really excited to be back here in UNLV for my second visit since I joined Brookings, and I hope to be seeing you also in the next few years with telling you a little bit about what we're doing and my colleagues are doing, and how hopefully giving you sharing a perspective on things, and also learning from you, which is also a big part of the reason of why I'm here. And I put there, as being an economist, I decided that instead of putting a title saying something, I'm just putting up a question, which we'll see if we can answer. But the first thing I have to tell you is that, thank you, Bill, for that great introduction, but I want to take us back in retaliation to that, to this event that happened, I think, 2 years ago when President Trump started bashing on the visa lottery. So you know the US has this diversity visa lottery in which people actually, through lottery, can get a green card. And he called those people the worst of the worst. So despite what Bill said, I just want to tell you that everything I say today, you should take it with a grain of salt, because I actually was one of the winners of that lottery. Right? So President Trump saying, you think the country is giving us their best people? No, of course not. They come in by lottery. They give us the worst people. So I'm one of them. So that you know that, just putting things in context. Thank you. Well, so, we're living in an era in which a lot of the rhetoric that we hear in the US and in many countries around the world, a lot of this populism is also translated into some statements that are really vivid today in the public narrative, such as the countries flooding with uneducated migrants. Migrants and refugees are taking over our jobs and lowering the wages for the American people. Migrants don't assimilate into our culture. and therefore that's bad. Migrants and refugees are criminals, and they're threatening the public safety. So, you know, you see these statements coming from a lot of places, a lot of politicians around the world in this time, and I think I want to maybe provide some evidence and some facts and see, you know, maybe to test out these statements and compare them to the data. And I think one of the things we should know is that even today, when you look at in relative terms, you look at migration flows, that's still a very small flow in the world. As of today, about 3.5% of the world population are foreign-born individuals, like migrants that move from one place to another. And that has stayed the same level since the 1960s. When you compare that, for instance, to trade, trade is a flow that has increased dramatically in the past 40 years as a percentage of GDP. Whereas migrants, it has stayed pretty much the same. So this is a flow. They're basically, when you economics think about flows, there are three types of flows. There's flow of goods, which is trade. There's flow of capital, which is foreign investment. And there's flow of people, which is migration. And I don't have FDI here, or international investment, but that also will be growing significantly as compared to migration, which has stayed pretty much the same across the year, which is something we, it's something to think about. But yes, it's true that migration, that was the world average. It has become more prevalent within certain countries. So for instance, among the developed countries like Canada, Australia, the US, Europe, migration has become a significant portion of the population, right? So of course that the number I showed you before was the global average. Within certain countries, it is true that you see more and more migrants. But at the same time, you do see an interesting fact, which is low-skilled migration is less and less common, at least in the US. Okay, so this graph actually coming from the Pew Research Center is showing that the share or the number of migrants coming into the US with less than a high school degree has gone down dramatically, whereas the number of migrants with a college degree or more has continued to go up. So the fact that, or the statement saying maybe that the country is being flooded with migrants without skills, it's not really, it doesn't fit with the actual numbers when you look at them. Now, I want to go through some of these ideas of why, that we hear often here and there, which is always important to look at the data. And the first, one of the big claims that we hear recently is that migrants tend to commit crime and are threatening the public safety. Well, when you look at the data, there's not a lot of evidence of that. For instance, this was a graph, I believe it was taken from the New York Times. This is not a very rigorous study, but just showing the raw data, and we see that while the immigrant population in the US has doubled since the 1980s, the crime rate, the violent crime rate in the US has gone down dramatically, right? So that doesn't mean that migrants might not be doing crimes, but there's definitely nothing in the data that supports that idea. The US has become a much safer place in the past decades, and the number of violent crimes have gone down at the same time that migration has gone up dramatically. But I'm not saying here that migrants don't commit crimes. Migrants commit crimes, Americans commit crimes. There's a lot of people committing crimes regardless of their origin. You do see in most countries, at least I do see, for instance, in Colombia, where I've been working quite a bit with the Venezuelan refugee crisis, that Venezuelan refugees commit crimes at a much smaller rate than their proportion in the population. So if anything, they're lowering the average crime rates in the country. But one of the things that economists have been looking at quite a bit is one aspect that could really explain the propensity of a migrant to commit crime, which is, are you allowed to work, right? Because if you're not allowed to work, maybe that could create the wrong incentives to go and find a way to sustain yourself. And fortunately, there's some of my colleagues, economists, have looked at this significantly. I think I brought you a little bit of a peek on some of these amazing studies that actually show that very rigorously. And Paolo Pinotti, who's a great economist looking at immigration of crime, he studied the regularization of immigrants in Italy in 2008. So about 650,000 undocumented immigrants at the time were regularized. And immigrants could get a work visa if an employer requested him or her. This included also domestic workers. But the interesting thing here, which gave a rise to a rigorous study, is that there were quotas by region defined by the government. Okay? So basically, these migrants could have gotten visas, but it really, the number of visas were defined by the government. So Pinotti, in his paper in 2016, he came up with a brilliant idea, which is, well, you know how economists were really obsessed with separating between correlation and causation. So, well, he came up with an idea on how to really look at whether the migrants that are getting access to the labor market change their behavior in terms of criminal activity. The reason you need a natural experiment is because if you just look at the data, you will maybe see that people who get visas, they tend to commit more crimes, but maybe it's because they are their own, they're not really, the fact that they're looking for a visa is because they don't want to commit crime, right? So here you're really trying to understand what happens when, for reasons that don't have anything to do with the migrant, him or herself, they're actually able to work. Anyway, the story is the following. The way that these migrants were able to get a visa, a work visa, was online, right? So once they had a job offer, they go online in that morning, and then they put the paperwork and click, right? But because there are quotas, it depends on when in the morning do you start clicking, you get the visa or not, right? So what this graph is showing, for instance, is that a lot of the times, since 8 a.m. when the website opens, the quota gets filled really early on, like at 8:30 a.m., right? So these are the number of clicks, let's say, in the website from the morning until the rest of the day, and you see that, you know, at 8:30, within half an hour, the quota is completely filled. So what Pinotti is doing, which is brilliant, is to compare the migrant that lost the chance to get a visa just for a few minutes against the migrant that actually had the visa just because thanks to a few minutes. And what they find is that this is what in economics you call a regression discontinuity. You're exploiting a discontinuity in the data. And what they find is that those that were lucky enough to click before the quota filled were much less likely to commit crimes afterward by even 50% than those that weren't that lucky to get the work permit. What does this mean? That if you're scared or if you're worried that migrants might commit crimes, let them work. But then you're going to say, well, if we let them work, they're going to steal our jobs. They're not going to steal the car, but they're going to steal our jobs. Well, let's see about that. And the question about migrants, whether migrants steal jobs or lower wages and all those kind of questions have to do with one big question, which is a very difficult question to answer, which is, are migrants and locals complements or substitutes? And it's as difficult as to answer whether peanut butter and jelly are complements or substitutes, right? What do I mean by complements and substitutes? Do migrants have the skills and the knowledge and the abilities that are exactly the same as the locals, so they can completely substitute their works, or they're actually bring different skills that they're complementing the local labor force? Of course, the answer is depends. It's very complicated. There are migrants that do, there are migrants that don't, but let's look a little bit let's look at the evidence. What most of the evidence has shown is that we are in a world in which each person can bring his or her own unique skills to an organization, to a firm, to a society, which usually complements the skills of others, right? We all have very specific skills that we're good at, and to some degree, we can work together and complement the work of each other. That also applies to migrants. This statement is much more obvious for college-educated migrants, perhaps, skilled migrants, right? I mean, after you studied and you worked, you probably have created skills that probably differ and can contribute to the firm. But the way to see this in economics is like, if in fact if migrants substitute for the local workers, so then when they flow into an economy, the local workers will tend to be unemployed, they're going to be displaced, their wages are going to go down. If they tend to complement them, actually wages could go up. Well, let's look a little bit of the data. This is a study that I really like by Rachel Friedberg in 2001 that looks at the case of the inflow of skilled workers into Israel from the former Soviet Union in the 1990s. In just 1 year, in 1990 alone, the population of Israel increased by 4% through the immigration of migrants from the former Soviet Union. And in total, during the whole decade, the population of Israel increased by about 20%. 20% is a big number, okay? So if we are going to see any effects of wages, of migrants flowing into economies on wages, we would see it here, right? Well, what this graph is showing is by each one of the industries that you can classify, what happened to the wage of the workers, of the Israeli workers in that industry, with the inflow of immigrants working into those same industries. And what you see here is a flat line with no slope. So meaning zero. There was no effect on wages to the local population. And the reasoning here is what we were saying before, that it turns out that these workers, these immigrants, are complementing to some extent the local labor force, and that they're not displacing them. They're just making everybody more productive, perhaps, or they're at the very least, they're not pulling them down. Now, of course, you might say, and you're right if you say that skilled migration, there might be less of a discussion because it's kind of obvious that they bring new skills, that they can be more productive and so on, but there's a big discussion about unskilled migration, which in the case of the US, for instance, is really important. I don't like the term unskilled migration. I like to follow Michael Clemens, a colleague from the Center for Global Development of one of the brightest economists of migration. He calls them fundamental workers, okay? People who have fundamental skills that are really the building blocks of the economy. And when you look at evidence in terms of these fundamental workers and labor markets, there's a little bit of mixed evidence, okay? But for the most part, studies would find that yes, the effect of an inflow of fundamental workers or fundamental migrants into an economy would result in either no effects on wages of the locals or a very small and negative effect. But that effect is temporary. Turns out that effect lasts until there's a replenishment of the capital stock. And let me tell you what I mean by that. If you are in a country or in a firm where suddenly there's a huge inflow of people, and that firm has 5 machines, and it has 5 machines and 5 workers, 1 machine per worker, and suddenly there's an inflow of 20 people, well, that's going to be very chaotic, right? It's going to be very difficult for that firm to operate with a new ratio of workers to machines. But once there's a bit of time that goes on, and once there's more investment in capital, and once you're able to bring more machines to that firm, you're going to return back to the original state where you had 1 machine per worker, in which wages will go to the original level. Okay? For instance, this train, this is not only about machines in firms, this is also about infrastructure in general, in the city or in the country, right? So this train is not very efficient because look at all the people that are trying to jump into the train, and of course, the train might be late, you might be late for your job. It can create a little bit of, it can hold back a little bit some process in the economy, but when there is this what we call replenishment of capital, once you are able to adjust your capital, which could be schools and could be hospitals and could be infrastructure or machines for firms, those wages should go back to the same levels they were before. Of course, this is really important in cases when there's a huge and massive and fast migration flow, which is usually not the case unless there are refugee crises, right? And that's why it's so important when refugee crises occur to put funding to help those countries that are receiving the refugees to help them replenish their capital stock, which, by the way, when you create schools and you create bridges and you create credit for firms, you're not only helping the migrants and the refugees, you're actually helping the community that is hosting them, because those bridges and schools and hospitals will stay there forever. And I think this actually captures that, right? When the manager says, I don't understand, 2 workers can make twice as much product as 1 worker, but now 2,000 workers are making anything, right? And yeah, of course, as long as you are unable to replenish the infrastructure and the capital, migration could have a temporary detrimental effect on wages, but that's, again, small as long as we've seen in the evidence. But there is a challenge to this, because everything I'm telling you is in terms of time, and usually it's very hard to see what's happening in the long run with data, because by definition it's hard with data to follow, for instance, the same person across time. Fortunately, one very bright economist was able to do that. His name is Giovanni Perri, with his co-author Fogget, and they actually looked at data from Denmark. Why Denmark? Because they have good data. And that data allowed them to look at local workers, and how their occupation and their jobs evolved across a longer period of time in response of a huge inflow of refugees and migrants coming into the economy. And this is the example, for instance, of how since the early 90s, you see a huge increase in the number of immigration into Europe, and particularly into Denmark, from several refugee crises, such as the former Yugoslavia, Somalia, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Actually, a lot of these people, 40% of these refugees, actually did not have a high school degree. So we're talking here about what we would call fundamental workers. So what Giovanni Perri and Fogget are looking at is what is actually happening to the Danish people in response to these workers. Because sometimes you see something that is very weird, because sometimes you see, when you have a migrant inflow, you see a positive effect on wages. That's kind of weird, isn't it? Well, what they found is that the entry of these fundamental workers into the economy resulted in upward occupational mobility of the natives. So in response to more competition from fundamental workers, the Danish people, who were perhaps competing in the same jobs, they move towards better jobs that are more complex, as you see here in the first graph, that pay higher wages, that are less intensive in manual tasks, and there was no displacement in terms of their job positions. And when you think about it, you can think about it in the context of every country. The fact that the US has a large population of migrants, of fundamental workers, that actually allow Americans to perhaps specialize in jobs in which they could earn more and and use much better one of the skills that they have over the migrants, which is speaking English, right? So if you have migrants that are willing to take jobs, which are very important fundamental jobs in the hospitality sector, in the restaurant industry, in the backside of the place, you will have Americans moving to the front side of the restaurant, where they are actually earning better wages and doing more complex jobs. And something that we don't see here, actually, for some reason, there should be some bars in this graph, but there is a fact that we need to know when we're thinking about migration. And we want the American workforce to be skilled. We want the American workforce to have better jobs. But you know, doctors need aides, engineers need cooks. You need to have restaurants, and you need to have aides, and you need to have a lot of fundamental workers in your economy. And what you're supposed to see here, which you don't see, but I'll tell you. These are the projections from the BLS, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, of the fasting growing occupations in the next 10 years. These are projections. And what you see here is, yeah, you see software developers, you see market research analysts, you see medical and health service managers and so on, but you also see carpenters, and you also see personal care aides, and you also see cooks in restaurants. So the US, in order to continue to grow, they are going to need more and more of these fundamental workers, which, surprise, one way to have them is from migration. Now, the other question you might ask, I pay taxes, even though I'm the worst of the worst. You all pay taxes, and you want to ask yourself, well, is this costing us money? You're telling us we should bring fundamental workers and, help the doctors. That all sounds funny, but, how much do I have to pay? Well, we also have an answer to that, thankfully. And the answer is in this book, which was released, I think, in 2017 by the National Academies of Sciences, in which people from economists from really across the board, some of the leading immigration economists from the US, studying immigration in the US and from the world, they came together to study that precise topic. Like, what is the fiscal burden, if anything, of the US of receiving migrants? And this document has about 600 pages, so you can go and Google it, but I'm going to tell you the bottom line of it, which is on page 434, which says, the total fiscal impact of a new immigrant who most resembles recent immigrants to the US creates a positive fiscal balance flow to all levels of government with an NVP, net present value, of $259,000. It's hard to argue with that. But of course, there's a lot of assumptions, there's a lot of heterogeneity, but in fact, if you look at the report, a lot of these assumptions are bringing this number a little bit down, okay? Because these assumptions are not taking into account that migrants eat, and therefore they pay taxes when they eat. Migrants work, and therefore the employer pay taxes when they work. Migrants, as I'm going to show you in a few slides, often make firms to become more productive. They help in creating networks for global trade. And those are all indirect effects on how actually fiscal resources could be created thanks to migrants, which this study, being conservative, and it makes sense because it's very hard to measure all those things, but they're assuming as they are very small or zero. Okay, and of course there's a lot of heterogeneity here in local governments and federal governments and so on, but even if you, this is a big number that if there was a good distributional process in place, it could actually be a net benefit for everybody. Okay, now that we know that migrants are going to help us grow and we don't have to pay for them, right? So then the question is like, wait, why don't we have more migrants? And let's just open borders, right? Well, that politically, of course, has consequences, but thankfully somebody else has thought about that. And this is Michael Clemens, a very esteemed colleague who works at the Center for Global Development, who I mentioned before, and he had this very thought-provoking paper called Economics and Immigration, $1 trillion bills on the sidewalk, right? And Michael claims, doing some calculations based on the work of many other economists, that in fact, if half the population of the poor region emigrates, migrants would gain 23 trillion, which is 38% of global GDP. For non-migrants, the net effect of these other changes could theoretically be negative, zero, or positive, right? If you still think that these migrants could really affect negatively the wages of locals, even if you take that into account, when you combine these factors with the gains to migrants, we might plausibly imagine overall gains of 20 to 60% of global GDP. Okay, so what's the logic behind it? You probably have heard a lot that opening up to trade creates gains from trade, right? So it creates efficiencies in the markets that end up in increasing the GDP of countries. There are distributional consequences of that inside of each country, but in general, opening to trade and opening to investment create gains from trade. And that's why we have a WTO, the World Trade Organization, that has worked for years to lower the tariffs between countries to be able to enjoy from these gains from trade. Well, there are also gains from migration. Turns out that when you reduce barriers to migration and you let people migrate to be more productive in the place where they can be more productive, that could have huge beneficial effects for overall GDP, global GDP. Well, so where are those gains coming from? Tell me, you're going to ask me now, tell me exactly what are you talking about? It's just people moving, what are they doing when they move and so on. So let me just give you a few examples. Let me start before dinner to tell you about the sriracha sauce, which I'm sure it's part of the table of many of the local cuisine here. You've seen this sauce, this same brand. It's very good. Well, let me tell you something maybe you didn't know about this sauce. It's called the Huy Fong Foods, the firm that produces this sauce. And this firm was founded by David Tran. David Tran founded this firm in 1980. Today, the firm employs about 200 workers in California, and it sells, the sales of the firm are more than $60 million per year. Well, the company was named after the freighter named Huy Fong that carried him and over 30,000 other refugees out of Vietnam to the coast of California in December of 1978. So this was a firm created by a refugee who today is creating benefits to the US, is creating jobs, and is creating sales, and it's creating dynamism in the economy. Is this the case only of David Tran? Well, some interesting facts that you actually might have heard of. When you look at the data, even though migrants are only 15% of the US population, they are overrepresented in new ventures and among inventors. So they are 15% of the population, but they are 25% of all entrepreneurs. 27% of all entrepreneurs to be exact. 37% of all of new firms have at least one immigrant entrepreneur in them. And 25% of the employees in new firms are immigrants. Okay? Why is this? Why are immigrants typically more entrepreneur than natives, you might ask? Well, because immigrants are by definition almost risk takers. The act of migrating is an act of taking a risk. And when they're in a new country, they're willing to take the risk of becoming entrepreneurships and creating jobs for the local population. And actually, when you think about these small firms that migrants are creating, because you may say, I mean, I'm not talking only about Google and, you know, and huge, vast firms. I'm talking about maybe small firms that you can see in the stores. And when you think about these small firms, these are the engine of growth, of job creation everywhere, including in America. Small firms, for instance, created about 1.5 million jobs a year in the US during the past decades. So often we hear from the White House lately that the several millions of jobs that the US have lost to the manufacturing industry. Well, you know, this seems pretty straight to me. If you want to create more jobs, maybe you want to let more migrants create new firms. And all this, just to give a little add to one of my mentors, all this is very well detailed in this amazing new book that I would really recommend you to look at by Bill Kerr. He's a professor at Harvard Business School, one of the brightest minds, researching for years high-skill migration and how they have shaped the innovation scene of the US and other countries. And it's called The Gift of Global Talent. Okay, I have just a few minutes left, so let me, I might skip for a few things. I might skip a few things, but some of the things that you also hear is whether migrants, because they don't assimilate, actually might be creating barriers that are stopping growth. Well, wrong again. There's research by Alberto Alesina, a Harvard professor, and Hillel Rappaport, my long-term co-author, who show actually that birthplace diversity of skilled migrants can explain increases in GDP and growth in the future. So the strength in terms of economic growth is on diversity and not, because precisely diversity is what helps the process of skill complementarity, of bringing different skills and creating more with the same resources. So when you think more broadly about how migrants are really important for the global economy, there are two main mechanisms that one can think of. The first one is networks. Migrants are able to create networks between countries that facilitate trade and global investment. And the other one, which is the research that I actually focus most of my time on, is the diffusion of knowledge. How migrants can move know-how and technology across borders that actually translates into real economic activity. And I'm going to skip a little bit the networks because I want to spend a little bit of time on the things that I've been working on. But I think one of the best examples of this is, again, the example of Vietnamese refugees in the US. It creates a perfect natural experiment that economists love, which is that when a lot of these refugees arrived to the US, they were randomly sent to different states of the country. They were allocated randomly to different states. And then what my colleagues Chris Parson and Luis Vecina have found is that this random allocation gives you a perfect setting to study what happens afterwards with trade between different US states and Vietnam when Vietnam actually opened to trade. And what you see is that, again, the states that received many more migrants or refugees at the time are the states that, as of today, are trading much more with Vietnam, thanks to the links that migrants themselves help create between firms that, you know, trading is a hard thing. You need to know somebody there, you have to have the contact, you have to speak the language. Migrants are the perfect bridge for this very complicated economic activity. Now, I want to talk about this other aspect, which is something I focus quite a bit in my research, and I think it's one of the reasons that I truly believe that migrants are, in fact, a key to economic development and growth in the world for the developed countries, but also in particular for the developing world. And one fact that every economist would know and tell you is that productivity is what explains the majority of cross-country income differences. Okay, if you take all countries in the world, you look at what is their GDP per capita, which is a pretty good measure of how rich they are and how good they're doing. That correlates very strongly with productivity. TFP is total factor productivity. Now you're going to ask me, what is TFP? Well, we don't know. Right? 60% of cross-country income differences explained by productivity, but we don't really know what it is. Okay? And actually, this is a phrase from Moses Abramovich, who said it's a measure of our own ignorance. Okay? Because basically productivity, the way that we economists measure it, is a residual, right? So if you think that you have two firms, that both of them have the same amount of workers and the same amount of machines, but one of them produces twice as the other. So what explains that twice, that double amount? That's productivity, right? They must know something that is allowing them to do much more with the same resources, okay? That could be technology, it could be knowledge, it could be a bunch of different things. So that's the way I like to think about productivity, is knowing how to do more with the same resources. So, you know, when you think about this vast difference you see in the world between rich and poor countries, and I'm telling you now that knowledge drives productivity and productivity drives income, so you should tell me, well, then the poor countries should, you know, take that knowledge, right? Why don't they do it? Well, there are three types of knowledge that you can roughly speak about. The first one is knowledge-embedded goods. For instance, calculators. You don't need to know how to add or subtract if you have the calculator, right? The knowledge is inside. That cannot explain differences across countries because you can buy and sell the calculator and, you know, across borders and so on. That is not difficult, it's not expensive. Then you have codifiable knowledge, the knowledge you can put on a patent, right? So then you can go to the patent, read it, and understand exactly what is it that you need to become better and do it, right? But that also cannot explain big differences because those are online, and you can just access them very easily. But there's a third type of knowledge that I think is part of the key here, which is tacit knowledge. It's the knowledge that resides in our brain, the knowledge that is very hard to transfer and to acquire. It's the knowledge that you have on how to ride a bicycle, that you know how to ride a bicycle, but you cannot explain it to me. You cannot explain it to anybody. It's the knowledge that you know somebody's face, but you cannot explain somebody's face, right? So it's that knowledge that resides in our brain, which is also important for our works, for our productivity. We are good at what we do because we learn a lot of things that are hard to explain, and a doctor becomes a doctor when he or she sits next to another experienced doctor that explains how to do the things, right? And that is a good candidate to explain the differences, because this knowledge is very difficult to transfer, and is limited to human interaction, as Kenneth Arrow said. So what's my point here? Tacit knowledge is very difficult to transfer and to acquire. For instance, if you have a toothache tonight, I hope you don't, but if you have it and you try to fix it yourself by going to Wikipedia and reading how to fix it, I guarantee you won't be able to fix it unless there's a dentist here in the room, right? There's a lot of tacit knowledge that the dentist has that he or she will help you to fix that, right? Or I'm flying on Friday back to DC, and the scenario I want to avoid is that the pilot will say, welcome to your flight. It's the first time I actually fly a plane. I had A's on all my physics exams, but it's actually the first time I do it. No, you don't want that. You'll get off the plane. You want somebody that has the tacit knowledge to do what they do. And in production, that tacit knowledge is really important. And this tacit knowledge travels through very narrow channels, and its diffusion is very geographically localized. We have a lot of evidence of that the knowledge diffuses very locally. Patents tend to be cited by inventors that are nearby geographically. Firms have spillovers that are also bounded to geographic areas, so like domestic firms benefit from foreign firms only if they're nearby. And there's a lot of evidence on that I've worked on, which I'm going to skip for the sake of time, because I want to get to my point, which is how migrants fit into this story. And the way that migrants fit into this story is the following. I'm telling you that knowledge is very difficult to acquire, very difficult to transfer, but at the same time it's really important for productivity and for production. So if knowledge transmission requires human interaction, my premise is that the patterns of international knowledge diffusion should follow the patterns of international migration, which is the most extreme case of labor mobility. It's the most extreme case of you seeing people, workers who move from one place to another, is when they cross borders and moved hundreds or thousands of miles, right? So if migrants carry that knowledge with them and carry that technology with them, and they move across borders, I should be able to see what's happening in the new country when they arrived based on the knowledge that I think they had when they left. Well, this is the story of Franchot Valley. Franchot Valley is this beautiful town outside of Cape Town, South Africa, 40 kilometers away from Cape Town, South Africa, which has, as of today, some of the best and most renowned wineries of South Africa. Franchot Valley Franchot means the French corner in Afrikaans. Well, this little town was founded in the late 17th century by French Huguenot refugees that were expelled from France by King Louis XIV. And now they make wine. Interesting. So we took that to the data, and we asked, if we have a country that is called France that is an exporter of wine, exports wine at really huge quantities, and we have a country called South Africa that exports rugby jerseys competitively. And then we see French people moving from France to South Africa. Well, what we find is that South Africa becomes a competitive exporter of wine from scratch. They didn't do any wine, and now they're doing wine at competitive levels, competing with people, with other countries around the world. And we also see that France becomes an exporter of jerseys. Okay? What other outcomes we can see where migrants affect the economy? Well, maybe through innovation. And what we did in this paper that we're actually currently working on is to look at different technologies in terms of patenting. And we took all the patents in the world, and we took every single technology that patents are classified in, which are about 1,000, and we took every country in the world where the inventors are. And imagine you have cells for each country and every technology of patents. And we divide in that cell all the patents that have happened in that country, in that technology, by chronological order, right? So we divide that in 10. The first 10 patents that appeared ever in a country in a given technology, the second 10%, the third 10%, the fourth 10%, and so on until the most recent patents. And what we ask is, what is the probability that in each one of these deciles, we're going to see an inventor who is a migrant and who had worked in the same technologies in a previous country where they were coming from. And what we see is that the first 10% of patents ever in a given technology in a country have a much higher likelihood of having a migrant as an inventor. And that stays on for the second 10% of patents, for the third 10% of patents, and then it disappears. So after 30 or 40% of after the first 40% of patents in a given country in technology, the ability to keep innovating that technology is completely embedded in local inventors. But without the migrants, you might not have gotten there. We also look, for instance, at whether there are flights, the connection of direct flights between inventors. Does that help innovators to work together and to create more patents? And we find yes. Also looking at a discontinuity. If you knew flights that are above 6,000 miles and below 6,000 miles have different regulations, because above 6,000 miles, which is about 12 hours, you need an additional pilot and more staff in the plane. So there are many less flights, direct flights, that are just above 6,000 miles as compared to flights just below 6,000 miles. So we compare those inventors that are 6,000 miles and one apart and 5,990 miles apart. And some of them, the likelihood that they have a non-stop flight is very different in between them. And we find that having a non-stop flight in between them, which allows them to communicate and to work together and to visit each other, increases significantly the chances that they're going to work together and that they're going to patent more, they're going to cite themselves much more. Let me finish up with a story of refugees, because those are the examples in which, on one hand, you think these are the people that are desperate and maybe they don't bring the skills that we want, and particularly now it's very important given that I think in October for the first time the amount of refugees that the US will receive are 0. I think it's important to keep in context, and this is a project that we've been working on for a couple of years, where we're looking at the case of refugees, Yugoslavian refugees in Germany. And this also provided us a natural experiment, because it turns out that when the disintegration of Yugoslavia started and there was a bloody war, it created forced displacement of 16% of the Yugoslavian population at the time, a lot of them actually went to Germany. Germany received them, and you see how the amount of Yugoslavians in Germany, which is the thick black line, goes up dramatically in the early 1990s. But then when the war ended in Yugoslavia, their visas expired, and they were repatriated, and they were enforced to go back or to leave Germany. And that's why you see how the stock against goes down after 1996, when the peace treaty was signed. Again, this gives us a setting to study what happened in Yugoslavia, in their home countries, after these people went to Germany and worked and were exposed to better technologies or to better work practices, et cetera, et cetera. And for instance, we look at this at a very granular level of different industries. We have about 800 industries, which are very granularly defined. For instance, furniture parts, wood of coniferous, I don't even know how to pronounce that, chemical products, iron steel structures, and so on. And we know exactly how many Yugoslavian refugees were working in Germany in each one of these industries and went back after the war was over. Well, our results suggest that the industries in the Yugoslavian countries combined after the migrants return back, performed much differently depending on how many returnees from each industry were there. So what this graph is telling you is the exports of all of the Yugoslavian industries divided in 4 groups. The thick line is the group that received many more refugees that were working in the same industries back in Germany. And this line, the blue line, is the third group, and then you have the 2 other groups. And you see how after 1995, when Yugoslavians start to come back from Germany to Yugoslavia, the industries that actually had, that received back many more of these workers that were working in the same industries performed much better. These are all fancy ways of showing you the same thing, but one aspect of our research is looking at whether this is about knowledge and technology or it's about something else that we might not be measuring. And we're pretty certain that this is going to be a long task, but so far we're pretty certain that this has to do with knowledge and productivity, because the refugees that are driving our results are refugees who are in occupations that are in tasks that are analytical and cognitive and not manual tasks. In supervisory roles, they're managers. In firms or refugees that experience a fast wage growth while they were in Germany, meaning that they learned something and they became more productive while they were there. So I've given you a lot of information, and I want to wrap up a little bit with some policy insights, which are, of course, one of the reasons that we're here. From this previous study, some people usually will ask me, so what is the policy recommendation, that you should kick out your refugees? No, that's not it. The policy recommendation is that you should integrate them as much as possible. You should let them gain the skills, you should let them gain the knowledge, because you are going to win from that, and then they actually might be a huge asset for the reconstruction of their countries when they're back. So this whole research, I think, is really it's really important in an era where we're seeing important productivity slowdowns that we don't quite understand why. And perhaps the key to revert that trend of productivity slowdown is to actually allow or find ways to exploit this mobility of people across countries that can really play a huge role in transferring knowledge and creating trade links and all of these gains that we've been talking about. And there is a role for government on that. For instance, I like to think that government plays a role when there are clear market failures that the government can come and fix. And in this case, for instance, we know that small firms might benefit from having their workers go abroad, get trained, and come back. But they might not do it because it's a big risk that they might not come back. And even though it's better to train your workers and have them leave than to keep them untrained, there is an externality here. There might be a role for government to help the promotion of labor mobility for these particular cases. So let me stop here and take really your questions, and hopefully we can continue the discussion. Thank you. Yes.
Do you have any comments on the future of migration into the United States under the expressed new policies of very small migrant numbers and only letting in people with higher education?
Well, yeah, I have thoughts. I think that all the rhetoric, even if it doesn't become policy, is going to be very detrimental to the US. I think that even if the message is we want high-skilled migration only, when you actually see some of the actions, that's not quite the case. You already see nowadays that we're in a university campus, so you already see nowadays, maybe you felt it, that the number of applications from foreign students have gone down. Because this whole rhetoric might make the best people rethink, should I go to the US and try to do a career, or should I just go to Canada? And you do see, for instance, in Canada, the amount of applications from foreign students have gone up. So this rhetoric only in itself could have really bad consequences on the future of productivity, dynamism, innovation. And if you think about it, sometimes I myself, a migrant, get really frustrated. And I think sometimes of, let's start a campaign and let's all of us migrants leave. And let's see what the US, who's going to patent anymore. And I'm exaggerating a little bit, but if you take all the migrants out of Silicon Valley, you know, it's going to be a very different valley. So I do think it's very detrimental, and I hope that we're going to see a change on that rhetoric. Yes?
The study looks like based on legal immigration, not on illegal.
I do have a study looking at undocumented migration in Colombia, for instance, where the government regularized almost 500,000 Venezuelans. And what we see there is that actually we see, he's on the making, so we see pretty good effects on the society as a whole. Now, for an economist, the very big difference between an undocumented migrant and a documented migrant is that they cannot work, right? So if you have, as I said before, a problem, I mean, if the US thinks really that there's a big problem with undocumented migrants being a burden to the economy, so they should be let work. I know that has political consequences and there's a political aspect to it, but as an economist, keeping migrants undocumented and living under huge uncertainties on whether they're going to be kicked out of this country dramatically bring all of us down, because if you don't know if you're going to stay here for 6 months or for 5 years, you're less likely to invest in yourself, to invest in your family, to try to start a new business and so on. So, I mean, everything we said, you know, all the research you see applies to undocumented migrants as well, as long as they have the same rights, right? Now, there's a whole political discussion on that, which I'm not getting into, but the difference is not in their skills. The difference is on their papers that they don't have. Carmen.
A bit of a contemporary question with the situation in Syria right now, with the withdrawal of U.S. troops, meaning that there's going to be a large influx of refugees from Syria. There already has been to other places, but the action by the White House currently was to use the alliance with NATO to basically make those movements there. And so now that we're seeing an influx, a higher influx and a renewed influx of Syrian refugees possibly going to Europe, I'm thinking of France specifically because there's already a high presence of refugees there. Without the US giving funds to France to do what you said, which is supplement or host them, what can be the consequences, or where would it come from?
Well, I mean, usually for the most part, it's unlikely that those migrants will actually, those refugees will actually even arrive to Western Europe. They will probably, I mean, based at least on the previous dynamics, they will go to countries such as Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, where most of the Syrian refugees are, the vast majority. And those are developing countries that you know, will struggle with that. In fact, when you look at the amount of funding that was given to the Syrian refugee crisis in 8 years since the war started, it's about $33 billion, which is a very large number. And there are some political dynamics there on perhaps Europe being more generous with aid so that these countries can actually absorb these refugees to avoid a backlash of refugees. Just that has been very different, for instance, from the refugee crisis in Venezuela, which so far there are 4.5 million Venezuelans in the continent, compared to 6 million or almost 7 million in Syria, from Syria. That crisis has received about $33 billion so far. The crisis in Venezuela has received from the international community less than $1 billion. It's going to be chaotic, and I see it, for instance, in Latin America, it's becoming a real problem of countries trying to struggle with their infrastructure. So, you know, it generates more chaos, those decisions, and are unfortunate.
I want to be respectful of everybody's time, so unfortunately, I'll technically draw our hour to a close. And thank you, Dany, for your information, and thank you for your attendance. Dany will be around if you have a question we didn't have time to get to. I usually talk about our next lecture, but this is actually our last public lecture of the fall. But please stay tuned. We'll be hosting an event in about a month. On November 20th, we'll have another colleague out from Brookings, Jenny Schutz, who's done some, I think, fascinating research on housing and home ownership in Las Vegas. So we'll return to a domestic topic, if you will, for that. And something of keen interest, I think, and enlightenment to all of us. So I hope we can see you back then. Thanks again for coming.